The Dutch East India Company wasn't a trading firm, it was a sovereign nation with a military, a navy, and the power to wage war, and it answered to shareholders. By 1602, the Dutch had a problem. Spain and Portugal had already carved up the spice trade, the oil of the 17th century. A pound of nutmeg could buy a house in Amsterdam. A single shipment of cloves meant generational wealth. But getting there meant crossing oceans controlled by enemies with better fleets and deeper treasuries. So the Dutch did something nobody had tried before. They pooled their money, created a corporation, and gave it a navy. That corporation was the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, and it changed everything about how power moves through the world. Exhibit 1, the VOC's founding structure. This wasn't a family business or a crown monopoly. It was a joint stock corporation. Merchants pooled capital around 5 million guilders at launch and received shares in return. They could trade those shares. Profits were divided by stake. The genius wasn't the spice trade itself, it was the mechanism. For the first time, risk was distributed across many people instead of crushing one merchant family. That meant more people could afford to bet on dangerous voyages, and more capital meant bigger ships, better weapons, longer supply lines. Exhibit 2, the VOC's military apparatus. By 1610, the company employed more soldiers than the Dutch army itself. It built forts across the Indonesian archipelago, Batavia, the Moluccas, Banda. It maintained a fleet that dwarfed rival traders. The Dutch weren't just buying spices, they were conquering territory and holding it with cannon and musket. Here's what matters, the company paid for all of this. The Dutch crown didn't fund conquest, shareholders did. The VOC's board of directors didn't ask permission from The Hague to wage war, they voted on it like a board meeting. Nobody in this story is stupid. Look at the incentive. If you own stock and the company seizes the Banda Islands and monopolizes nutmeg, your dividend explodes. Exhibit 3, the body count. The VOC's conquest wasn't bloodless. In the Banda Islands, the company orchestrated the massacre of the local population. Thousands died to consolidate its monopoly on nutmeg and mace. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was economics. Fewer people meant lower labor costs and guaranteed supply control. The company then imported enslaved people to work the plantations. Profit margins widened. Stock prices rose. This is the part of capitalism's origin story that gets footnoted, not centered, but it's the foundation. By the 1650s, the VOC controlled roughly half of all European trade in the Indian Ocean. It wasn't the biggest empire by land, that was still Spain or Portugal, but it was the most profitable. And here's the kicker, it was entirely private. The Dutch state licensed it, sure, but the company governed itself, set its own foreign policy, and kept the profits. It minted its own coins, it negotiated treaties, it conducted diplomacy. It was a state wearing a merchant's coat. The VOC lasted nearly 2 centuries. By the time it dissolved in 1799, it had paid out dividends for 197 years straight. No modern corporation has matched that record. It generated wealth so immense that it helped finance the Dutch Golden Age, the art, the architecture, the libraries you see in Amsterdam today. Rembrandt's paintings were funded by nutmeg. The canals were dug with spice money. That's not hyperbole, that's the direct line from monopoly to culture. But here's what makes the VOC the template for everything that came after. It proved that a private corporation could do what only governments were supposed to do. It could wage war, it could conquer territory, it could enforce contracts with violence, it could extract resources from distant lands and ship them home for profit. Every modern multinational that operates in a weak state, every private military contractor, every corporation that lobbies governments, they're working from the VOC playbook. The VOC also invented the shareholder structure that still dominates global capitalism. Dispersed ownership, limited liability, transferable shares, quarterly profit focus. These weren't features designed for ethics or long-term thinking. They were designed to attract capital and reduce personal risk, and they worked. They worked so well that every corporation on Earth now uses them. The mechanism that made spice monopolies profitable is the same mechanism that runs your pension fund. What happened to the VOC? Efficiency killed it. By the late 1700s, competing European nations had learned the same trick. Britain, France, and others started their own chartered companies. Competition eroded margins. Corruption inside the VOC's bureaucracy drained profits. Shareholders demanded returns, but the golden age was over. The company went bankrupt in 1799. Its assets were seized by the Dutch state. The era of the private megacorporation ended, at least temporarily. The state took back monopoly on violence. The lesson isn't that corporations are evil or that the VOC was uniquely corrupt. The lesson is that the incentive structure matters more than the ideology. The VOC wasn't run by cartoonish villains twirling mustaches. It was run by rational actors responding to shareholder pressure, competitive markets, and the absence of meaningful regulation. Give any organization the power to extract wealth, the means to use violence, and the promise of profit. And this is what you get. It's not a bug in the system, it's the feature. Today we think of corporations and governments as separate spheres. One makes policy, one makes profit. But the VOC showed that boundary is a choice, not a law of nature, and that choice is currently being renegotiated. Private military contractors operate in failed states. Tech companies enforce rules that governments won't. Corporations lobby for trade agreements that rewrite national law. We're not returning to the VOC model. The modern nation-state is too entrenched, but we're not moving away from it either. We're in a hybrid zone, and understanding the VOC is how you understand the hybrid. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Subscribe for weekly deep dives into the geoeconomic forces that shaped history and still shape your world. Subscribe for weekly deep dives into the geoeconomic forces that built empires and still move markets today. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.